Good evening. I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel tonight are Barbara Taylor, KCBS City Hall reporter, and Scott Schaefer, host of the California Report on KQED Public Radio, and Carla Marinucci, San Francisco Chronicle senior political writer. Carla, there is so much going on in politics today.
Right.
Let's start with the vice presidential debate. People said they wanted action. What do they get?
That's right. You can almost hear the cheers coming out of San Francisco, the bars and so forth, as this was going on this week. A slugfest, a political slugfest, and this is what the Democrats wanted to see. If Joe Biden had one job at this event, it was to pump up the base. He did that job this week after Obama's disappointing debate. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we saw Obama here this week. This was a very busy week in politics, and it is all about enthusiasm in the base in places like San Francisco, Northern California. If voters here on the Democratic side are not enthusiastic about getting out there for Obama, if he doesn't have, if they don't have his back, he's got trouble in congressional races and fundraising and everything else. And we saw his events in San Francisco this week. We were inside a couple of those events, and boy, they turned out. They were very excited, and he seemed much more fired up. I have to say, in the last couple of times we've seen him, he has seemed a little too down key, low key, almost sleepwalking, it seems, through some of these events. And this week in San Francisco, in the wake of that debate, he got such terrible reviews. I think he's gotten the message, and certainly Joe Biden's gotten the message that they better pump up the energy.
San Franciscans still don't mind writing those big checks, huh?
No, apparently not. And you know, as we reported today, Susie Tompkins Buell, one of the big Democratic donors who was withholding checks, was there at that Alice Waters event, hugging Obama. He was hugging her. All is forgiven. She was a big supporter of Hillary Clinton.
Is there a lot of grumbling, though, among Democrats that the only reason Obama comes here is for the money, that he really spends very, very little time out on the stump talking to people? He really can't even be bothered with that. He views California as a Democratic win, so let's move on to Ohio.
And he never really does any press events when he's here, right? He doesn't really want to take any questions, I think, from San Francisco.
Well, actually, we should say that on this trip to California, which is his 17th trip to California, he actually did a public event aimed at the Latino vote, which was in the Central Valley of California, where he went to Keene and he inaugurated the Cesar Chavez National Monument, the headquarters of the United Farm Workers. This was a very big deal, and it really sort of dramatizes the importance of the Latino vote, not just in California, but everywhere in these swing states. When you're talking about Colorado, Nevada, this is a must-win vote. He's ahead by a very wide margin, but you've got to get that vote energized and pumped up.
Coming back to the debate, you know, Joe Biden, of course, the Democrats loved it, but he was a little criticized for being a little too hot, you know, a little bit too smiling, laughing too much, interrupting, and then Obama had been criticized for being too cool. So I'm wondering, is this like the Goldilocks debates where they're going to, the next one too hot, too cool, and then just right?
You're absolutely right, and I think next week Obama has a challenge, because after being so low key at the first one, he has to come out swinging at the one on Tuesday, and you know, he can't be two different personalities. But the fact is, there's a lot at stake at these debates. It's not just about the undecided vote. There's a lot of down-ticket races here in California that depend on Democrats being excited about getting out there to vote. We heard Nancy Pelosi this week at Willie Brown's breakfast. Mm-hmm. She talked about the Democratic chances of getting back the House. They need 25 seats to do that. According to Pelosi, that's going to be done. A lot of political strategists say, no way, it's not going to happen. But even here in the Bay Area, you know, there's some seats. John Garamendi, when you talk about Ami Bera and Dan Lundgren, when you talk about Jerry McNerney, these are seats that could go either way, and it really depends on Democrats getting out there.
I find a certain irony in that so many Democrats didn't like the redistricting process, and yet it now appears that they have an opportunity to win seats that they couldn't have gotten otherwise if they had been in charge of redistricting.
Although with the top two primary, though, now there's two Republicans running against each other down
or in the East Bay, it's two Democrats.
Yeah, but there's also a lot where there's two Democrats where the Republicans just got booted out of the picture completely.
Well, and then Berman and Sherman this week. down in Los Angeles. They almost came to blows against each other.
That's right. I mean, it's so the political landscape has changed this time around, no question about it. And this is why I think the presidential race sort of sets the tone for the whole thing.
Carla, you were the pool reporter. Now we have to explain what that means. That means you get a little bit closer. Maybe you could even touch the president. I'm not sure about that. But do you think that with having to say the most important points over and over again as president, that anything he says is going to sound fresh and new? You know,
it's a very good point, Belva, because you said, 17 times here in California. On Monday alone, he did 4 or 5 events of 3 fundraisers alone in San Francisco. The night before, he had done a couple in LA. You have to wonder how many of these you can do. And on some days, Obama is doing 6 fundraisers in a single day. I don't know how you keep doing that. And some of the people on the inside are wondering, is this taking a toll in one way or the other? The endless fundraising. It has got to be sort of wearing on the candidates, both sides.
And unlike Bill Clinton, he's not somebody apparently who really likes to be out pressing the flesh and performing.
And we should mention that Bill Clinton came to the Bay Area this week at UC Davis, and that's where he delivered just another bang-up tour de force.
I have to get just a moment in with you about the Latino vote.
Yeah.
Has it risen to a new plateau in terms of importance?
Absolutely. When you're talking about 4 million potential voters in California, that the Democrats are looking at the biggest state. We have the biggest group of Latino voters. These are voters that are going to make the difference in every one of these congressional races. And of course, we know it looks like Obama is going to win comfortably here in California, but it has changed the landscape of the Western United States, particularly in these swing states, Nevada and Colorado, that are must-win states. So absolutely.
Well, we're going to move to some of our propositions, and I might mention right away here that we'll be talking about Proposition 30 and 38, that's the education proposition, on next week when our entire program will be devoted to education. But Scott Schaefer, you're going to take on the prison stuff tonight. That is the death penalty.
Criminal
and
justice.
3 strikes.
Yes, we've got 2 ballot measures. Prop 34, which would abolish the death penalty in California, replace it with life in prison without the possibility of parole. The last time the death penalty was on the ballot was 1978, the Briggs Initiative, Proposition 7, and it passed overwhelmingly. And the argument this time against it, in part, is cost. At least that's what the proponents are saying. There are a lot of people who oppose the death penalty for other reasons. But fundamentally, the death penalty really isn't happening in California. The leading cause of death on death row is old age or suicide. The death row population has gone from 0 to 730. And we haven't had an execution in 6 years. So there are some people that say, look, let's just get rid of this. It can't be fixed. On the other hand, opponents say, wait a minute, it can be fixed with reform, but the legislature won't do the reforms. These things die in committee to speed up the appeals process and things like that. So, but the polls show that it's very tight on Prop 34, it's split right down the middle. So the yes side has a lot of money. They raised about $4 million. The opponents really, there doesn't seem at this point to be any organized campaign against ending the death penalty.
Well, one of the arguments I have heard on the other side on this one is that if you get rid of the death penalty, it takes away sort of a key bargaining chit that law enforcement has when they're looking at some of these convicted or trying for convictions. What about that argument?
I suppose that's possible, and DAs overwhelmingly oppose Prop 34. I think George Gascon in San Francisco is the only district attorney who has come out in favor of it. He thinks that it just doesn't work, it's not effective, and so on. So that could be a factor, but the reality is too, and your colleague Bob Agelko had a story in the Chronicle a week or so ago that people on death row oppose Prop 34 because their appeals will end, and they think that they won't have a chance to prove their innocence, right? I mean, they all think they're innocent. So,
but don't they still have an opportunity, whether they're on death row or not, to go through a court process, or does it just at some point come to an abrupt end and they're stuck there?
If you're saying if Prop 30 currently, do you mean currently?
No, not currently. If there is no death penalty, I mean, they don't relinquish their right to go through a court process.
Well, but now there's an automatic appeal, for everybody on death row, and so they have lawyers provided to them, and the state pays for it, not very much, but they do, and so that would go away. I mean, they wouldn't be entitled to that. I mean, they would have to do it on their own.
It has been interesting to me that the argument, which in the past has been almost exclusively a moral issue, an ethical issue. You know, should the state be executing people no matter what their crime is? And it's gone from that to an economic issue.
Well, and I think that's
that
because
made it more effective. I mean, it seems to be
It's
a much
a
more
better
effective
argument.
Well, I think the poll, I'm sure they based that on the polling and what the focus groups show, that is the most effective argument. Everyone knows the state is broke, and so they say that if you end the death penalty, that the state would save about $130 million a year. But you know, we'll see whether that's. I think more people probably see that it just we're not executing anybody, so why have it?
Scott, there's another group of people who are in for life, just like some of those on death row, and that is those sentenced under the 3 strikes law.
Yeah.
There's a movement now to change at least part of the makeup of that law.
Yep, the other ballot measure, Prop 36. California, there are about 26 states that have a 3 strikes law. California is the only one where the 3rd strike doesn't need to be a serious or violent crime. And so you have some people on serving 25 to life who, you know, in extreme cases, shoplifted something, but they got sentenced under the 3 strikes law. And so Prop 36 would require that 3rd strike be a serious or violent crime, and if people who are in on a 3rd strike now, whose crime wasn't serious or violent, they could go back and have it resentenced. And so it would bring it more in line with how other states do it right now with 3 strikes.
And who decides what serious is? Is there a criteria?
The penal code. No, it's written into the penal code. And you know, there was a ballot measure a few years ago.
Yeah, what's the difference between this one and that one? The voters turned that one down.
Prop 66 in 2004, and you may recall that was leading in the polls. It also would have made the 3rd strike required to be violent, but it went further than that, and it would have recategorized some crimes. It would have downgraded some crimes so that they would no longer be categorized as violent or serious, and those prisoners who had been sentenced under those previous serious and violent crimes would have also been affected and gotten a less sentence. It almost passed, but at the last minute, a millionaire in Orange County spent about $3.5 million, and Arnold Schwarzenegger went on TV. He was still popular then, and was very effective, and it ended up losing narrowly.
But this doesn't eliminate 3 strikes. It changes the criteria.
It changes the criteria, and it doesn't really, because it's fairly narrowly written, it only affects a few thousand people who are currently in prison, potentially. And it's gotten pretty broad support. I mean, Steve Cooley, the district attorney in Los Angeles, who was very opposed to that previous ballot measure, is supporting it along with George Gascon. They actually wrote the ballot argument together in support of Prop 36. So this one seems to have much broader support than
let's look at another part of the criminal justice system, the ability to get a sheriff to run our jail system here has been a long-running soap opera for us. Ross Mirkarimi has got a vote from his friends. He's back reinstated. So now what happens, Barbara?
Well, you know, conventional wisdom was that by the time we were sitting here this evening, the sheriff, Ross Mirkarimi, would be out of a job. In fact, something else entirely happened. After a 9-hour hearing at the Board of Supervisors, the vote was 7-4. To reinstate him. It would have taken 9 votes to remove him from sheriff. And just for people who might have been hiding in a cave for the past year, he found himself in this predicament of being accused of official misconduct because of a domestic violence incident that occurred on New Year's Eve, in which he got into a fight with his wife and he grabbed her arm and bruised her arm. His wife, Ileana Lopez, went to a neighbor, recorded a videotape tearfully describing this domestic violence incident. The woman who recorded the video later went to the police, and from that point it just snowballed. He was charged with several counts related to domestic violence, and ultimately entered into a plea bargain in which he pled guilty to a charge of false imprisonment. He thought that would be the end of it. Instead, Mayor Ed Lee filed official misconduct charges against him. The charges went to the Ethics Commission, and then this week they landed at the Board of Supervisors.
Okay, and the big mystery is, why did the mayor go so far out on a limb on this one? Instead of just saying, look, let's let the court system take its role, and he really took an aggressive stance and called Mirkarimi even a batterer at one point.
a wife beater.
A wife beater. What happens to him? I mean, how much damage has he done politically to himself?
I think he's done horrible political damage to himself, but let me answer your first question first. I think there are actually two things. First of all, I think he truly believes that Ross Mirkarimi did commit spousal abuse in a way that rose to the level of official misconduct, and that he is therefore not fit to serve as sheriff. I think he truly believes that. I also think he was lobbied very, very hard, persistently, by domestic violence, anti-domestic violence advocates in the city, and they were very persuasive, and he came to believe that the sheriff should be removed from office.
You know, I think you could argue that the sheriff has very little to do with domestic violence cases, you know, in the city. At the same time, you've got San Francisco. Recently, we've learned that the record of the DA in prosecuting domestic violence cases is one of the worst in the Bay Area. A very large number of cases dropped. Why isn't there more focus on that from these same anti-domestic violence advocates who, you know, are trying to get Ross Mirkarimi tossed out?
I can't really answer that question, but I think what happens in situations like this is that it becomes as much about politics and making a symbolic statement as it does about the crime itself. And that's not to say that the crime was or was not serious. It's just that we have the sheriff, one of the city's in fact, the city's highest elected law enforcement officer. So it was really a perfect storm of events that this became an opportunity for domestic violence folks to really focus on the problem, and in the end, it backfired. And in answer to your question, I think that the mayor did do damage to himself. He didn't line up his votes ahead of time. You never go and do something like that without knowing who your votes are. The person he appointed supervisor, Christine Olagi, to fill Ross Mirkarimi's seat, voted against him. Who does that? Mm-hmm. You know.
Well, I think there's probably another chapter because the DA is still.
And there could be a recall.
Yeah,
we don't know about that yet,
yeah.
So the saga may not be over. But for the moment, Ross Mirkarimi is going back to work as sheriff, and he'll get back pay on top of it.
We moved.